Picture this: London, winter of 1602. In dimly lit taverns across the city, men with ink-stained fingers and salt-crusted boots huddle over mugs of ale, whispering about a miracle. Not gold, not silver, not even the fabled passage to China. They're talking about a tree. A scraggly, unremarkable tree growing wild along the coast of a continent most Englishmen have never seen and never will. They're talking about sassafras, and they believe it's going to make them rich beyond measure. They think it's going to save England from economic ruin. They believe it's going to cure every disease known to man. And for one brief, intoxicating moment in history, they're not entirely wrong to believe it, because sometimes the most absurd ideas are the ones that change everything. This is the story of America's first economic bubble, a speculative frenzy that happened before there was even an America to speak of. It's about how a medicinal root created a financial mania that rivaled anything Wall Street would produce 4 centuries later. It's about desperate investors, opportunistic explorers, indigenous knowledge systems, and the dangerous gap between what people want to believe and what's actually true. And it all started with syphilis. Yes, syphilis. Because every great economic disaster has to start somewhere ridiculous. The disease had exploded across Europe in the late 1400s, probably brought back from the Americas by Columbus's crew, though the exact origins remain contested among medical historians. What's not contested is the devastation. Syphilis swept through European populations like a plague, disfiguring and killing without regard for class or station. And European medicine had absolutely no idea what to do about it. Physicians tried everything: mercury treatments that poisoned patients almost as severely as the disease itself, bloodletting that weakened them further, prayers and penance that did nothing at all. People were desperate for a cure, any cure, and desperation creates opportunity. Enter guaiacum, a dense tropical hardwood from the Caribbean. Spanish physicians claimed it could cure syphilis, and whether it actually worked or not, well, that was almost beside the point. What mattered was that people believed it worked, and belief creates demand, and demand creates price inflation. By the early 1600s, guaiacum wood was selling for astronomical sums in European markets. But there was a problem. Spain controlled the Caribbean sources. Spain controlled the supply. And England, perpetually at odds with Spain, couldn't access enough guaiacum to meet the ravenous demand of its suffering population. This is where sassafras enters the story, carried on the tongues of explorers who'd made contact with indigenous peoples along the North American coast. Native communities had used sassafras root for generations, a versatile medicine in their pharmacological traditions. They brewed it into teas for fever and digestive ailments. They used it as a spring tonic, a blood purifier, a treatment for skin conditions. European explorers, observing these practices with the selective attention of men seeking profit, made a leap of logic that would change economic history. If indigenous peoples used sassafras as medicine, and if medicine meant curing diseases, then surely sassafras could cure the disease that mattered most. Surely it could cure syphilis. There was absolutely no evidence for this. None. Not a shred of medical justification. But evidence has never been significant when money is involved. The first substantial English expedition to harvest sassafras in commercial quantities sailed in 1602, commanded by Bartholomew Gosnold. Gosnold wasn't a household name like Drake or Raleigh, but he was competent, ambitious, and backed by investors who'd heard the whispers about sassafras profits. His mission was straightforward: sail to the North American coast, harvest as much sassafras root as his ship could carry, and return to England before Spanish privateers or Atlantic storms sent him to the bottom of the ocean. Simple, brutally simple. They made landfall on the coast of what's now Massachusetts in May 1602, and what they found exceeded their wildest expectations. Sassafras trees everywhere, growing wild, untended, free for the taking. The indigenous Wampanoag people they encountered were curious but not hostile, willing to trade and show the English where the best groves grew. The explorers set to work immediately, digging up roots with a frenzy that must have seemed bizarre to the indigenous observers. These strange pale men had crossed an ocean in wooden ships, endured storms and starvation and scurvy, all to dig up a common medicinal plant that grew naturally along every riverbank and forest edge. But the English weren't thinking about how common sassafras was. They were thinking about how rare it would be in London. They were thinking about scarcity, demand, and the golden rule of economics. Something is worth whatever someone will pay for it. And back in England, people would pay a fortune. Gosnold's expedition lasted only a few weeks on the American coast. They built a small fort on Cuttyhunk Island, more a storage depot than a settlement, and filled their ship's hold with sassafras root until the vessel sat low in the water. Then they sailed for home, leaving behind the fort, and a landscape slightly more disturbed but otherwise unchanged. They reached England in July 1602, and when they unloaded their cargo, the sassafras market went absolutely insane. Merchants who'd invested in the voyage saw returns that made their heads spin. The root sold for prices comparable to guaiacum, sometimes exceeding it. Apothecaries couldn't keep it in stock. Physicians prescribed it for everything from syphilis to common colds, because once you've decided a substance is a miracle cure, why limit it to just one disease? Testimonials flooded through London's medical community, many of them almost certainly fabricated or influenced by financial interests, but enough of them seemed genuine that the bubble kept inflating. People swore sassafras had cured them. They swore it had saved their lives. They swore it was the medical breakthrough Europe had been waiting for. And investors, watching this frenzy, started planning their own expeditions. The years 1602 to 1605 saw a parade of English ships sailing to the North American coast with one primary objective: harvest sassafras. Not establish colonies, not search for gold or the Northwest Passage, just dig up roots and sail home. Martin Pring led an expedition in 1603, focusing on the coast of Maine, and returned with another massive cargo of sassafras that sold for extraordinary prices. Other ventures followed, some successful, some lost to storms or navigation errors, but enough succeeded that the economic incentive remained irresistible. London's financial community, such as it was in the early 1600s, became obsessed with sassafras ventures. Investment syndicates were explicitly formed to fund these voyages. Merchants who'd never cared about the Americas suddenly studied maps and tide tables. The sassafras trade became, for a brief historical moment, the most exciting commercial opportunity in England. But here's the thing about economic bubbles. They depend on sustained scarcity. They rely on demand outpacing supply indefinitely. And sassafras, it turned out, was not scarce. The English kept harvesting it, voyage after voyage, ton after ton. The price should have collapsed immediately under the weight of oversupply, but it didn't right away because the market had convinced itself that sassafras worked. The belief sustained the price even as warehouses filled with root that sat unsold. Merchants kept buying from new expeditions, sure they could offload their inventory at a profit. The bubble didn't burst so much as slowly deflate, like a sail losing wind. By 1605, cracks were showing. Physicians were quietly admitting that sassafras didn't actually cure syphilis. Patients who'd spent fortunes on the root remained just as diseased as before. The testimonials slowed, then stopped. The price began to drop, not catastrophically, but steadily, inexorably. Investors who'd poured money into Sassafras ventures found themselves holding rapidly depreciating assets. Ships that had planned Sassafras expeditions were quietly redirected to other purposes. The miracle cure turned out to be just another tree root, mildly aromatic, possibly useful as a spring tonic, but indeed not the economic salvation of England. The Sassafras bubble collapsed by 1607, and while it didn't destroy the English economy, it did ruin individual fortunes and teach some expensive lessons about speculative investment. But here's what makes this story particularly important for understanding American history. The bubble didn't just affect economics, it affected how the English thought about North America. Before the Sassafras rush, most English interest in the Americas focused on piracy, attacking Spanish shipping, or searching for mythical routes to Asia. North America itself seemed relatively worthless, just a cold, forested obstacle between England and the riches of the Orient. But the Sassafras boom changed that perception. It proved that the North American coast held resources that could generate enormous profits, at least temporarily. It proved that investors would fund ventures on that coast. It proved that English ships could successfully make the Atlantic crossing, harvest resources, and return safely. And most importantly, it created a network of merchants and investors who'd already committed capital to American ventures and were now looking for the next opportunity. When the Virginia Company was formed in 1606 to establish a permanent English colony, many of its key investors were men who'd made and lost money in the sassafras trade. They'd learned hard lessons about bubbles and speculation, but they'd also learned that America could be profitable if approached correctly. The Jamestown settlement of 1607, with all its disasters and near failures, was partially financed by capital that had originally flowed into sassafras speculation. The economic infrastructure that would eventually support English colonization in North America was built, in part, on the ruins of the sassafras bubble. But let's step back from the macroeconomics for a moment and look at what was actually happening on the ground, because the human stories here are where things get complicated and interesting. The indigenous communities along the New England coast, primarily Wampanoag and neighboring peoples, watched the English sassafras frenzy with what must have been profound confusion. These Europeans arrived in enormous ships, clearly possessing advanced maritime technology, clearly coming from wealthy civilizations, and all they wanted was sassafras root. Not the hunting grounds, not the fishing rights, not the land itself, at least not initially. Just the origins of a common medicinal plant. The Wampanoag were pragmatic. If the English wanted sassafras, fine, trade for it. The Europeans offered metal tools, copper kettles, glass beads, and other goods that held value in indigenous trade networks. The sassafras was renewable. The roots would grow back. This seemed like a reasonable exchange, especially since the English clearly had no intention of staying. They'd arrive in spring, dig frantically for a few weeks, then sail away. Peculiar behavior indeed, but not threatening. The indigenous peoples couldn't have known what this trade meant in the larger context. They couldn't have known they were feeding a speculative bubble that would eventually redirect English colonial ambitions toward their lands. They couldn't have known that the economic networks being established through the sassafras trade would later be used to support permanent settlements. They were making rational, short-term decisions without access to the information that would have revealed the long-term consequences. This is one of the recurring tragedies of early contact between European and indigenous peoples: asymmetrical information. The Europeans understood, or at least suspected, that these trade relationships were preliminary steps toward colonization. The indigenous peoples generally did not, at least not initially, because why would they? Their own political and economic systems didn't work that way. Trade was trade. Mutual benefit was mutual benefit. The idea that trade could be a precursor to invasion and displacement wasn't part of their framework, at least not in 1602. Now, individual English expeditions varied wildly in how they treated indigenous peoples during the Sassafras boom. Gosnold's 1602 voyage seems to have been relatively peaceful, characterized by cautious trade and minimal violence. Martin Pring's 1603 expedition maintained good relations with the indigenous communities of Maine, at least according to English accounts. But other ventures were more aggressive, more willing to take what they wanted and deal with the consequences later. There are fragmentary records of conflicts, skirmishes, and indigenous people killed for resisting English sassafras harvesting on their lands. These incidents rarely made it into official expedition reports, which preferred to emphasize cooperation and thriving trade. However, enough evidence survives in peripheral sources to show that the sassafras boom wasn't entirely peaceful. And then there's the question of what the sassafras trade did to indigenous communities' own use of the plant. When a substance that's been part of your medical and cultural practices for generations suddenly becomes a valuable trade commodity, it changes how you relate to that substance. Some indigenous groups likely started harvesting sassafras more intensively to trade with the English, potentially depleting local supplies. Others may have become protective of sassafras groves, recognizing their new economic value. The plant's cultural meaning probably shifted, at least somewhat, from purely medicinal to also commercial. These are the subtle, often undocumented changes that happen when two economic systems collide. Back in England, the sassafras bubble was creating its own social disruptions. The sudden fortunes made by early investors attracted the attention of everyone from legitimate merchants to outright con artists. London in the early 1600s had a thriving culture of investment schemes and financial manipulation, and sassafras speculation fit right in. Promoters sold shares in expeditions that would never sail. They sold sassafras that was actually just similar-looking roots from English forests. They spread rumors about competitors' shipments to manipulate prices. The market for sassafras root became a market for sassafras futures, for speculation on speculation, for all the financial instruments that humans invent when they're trying to profit from anticipated price movements rather than actual goods. This attracted regulatory attention. English authorities, never particularly comfortable with unchecked market speculation, started imposing rules on the sassafras trade. Import duties, quality inspections, licensing requirements for merchants. These regulations didn't stop the speculation, but they did create a paper trail. And that paper trail is part of how historians know so much about the sassafras boom, despite its relatively brief duration. When governments start regulating something, they start documenting it, and documentation survives. The medical establishment's role in the sassafras bubble deserves particular scrutiny, because physicians and apothecaries were both victims and perpetrators of the fraud, often simultaneously. Many genuinely believed sassafras was a miracle cure based on indigenous people's use of it, falling into the classic colonial fallacy of assuming indigenous medical knowledge was both entirely accurate and directly transferable to European diseases. They prescribed sassafras in good faith, observed mixed results that confirmation bias interpreted as success, and reinforced the bubble through their professional authority. But other medical professionals were more cynical. They recognized sassafras was probably useless against syphilis, but prescribed it anyway because patients demanded it and were willing to pay premium prices. Some physicians had financial investments in sassafras expeditions and were prescribing the substance partly to drive demand for their own inventory. This conflict of interest between medical duty and financial profit isn't unique to the sassafras boom. It's a recurring theme in medical history, but it's particularly blatant here because the timeline is so compressed. You can watch in real time, through medical texts and apothecary records, as sassafras goes from untested curiosity to miracle cure to discredited fad in less than 5 years. The collapse of the sassafras market in 1605 to 1607 created real financial hardship for the people who'd invested late in the bubble. These were often small merchants and tradesmen who'd saved money or borrowed to buy into what seemed like a sure thing. When the price collapsed, they lost their savings. Some went bankrupt. A few ended up in debtor's prison. The big investors, the ones who'd gotten in early and sold at the peak, mostly escaped unscathed and moved on to the next opportunity. This pattern, where the wealthy profit from bubbles and the less wealthy suffer when they pop, is so familiar from modern financial crises that it's almost boring to point out. But in 1602, this dynamic was newer, less understood, and therefore more devastating to the people experiencing it. There's a tendency in historical narratives to skip quickly from the bubble burst to and then they learned their lesson. But that's not how it works. The investors who lost money in sassafras speculation didn't necessarily learn to avoid speculation. Many of them jumped into the next speculative venture, which happened to be Virginia Company stock and Jamestown colonization. They learned to be more cautious, maybe to diversify their investments perhaps, but they didn't learn that speculation itself was dangerous. Because from their perspective, speculation wasn't the problem. The problem was that they'd speculated on the wrong thing. If they could just find the right opportunity, the next big thing, they'd recoup their losses and then some. This is how the sassafras bubble led directly to Jamestown. The Virginia Company was founded in 1606, just as the sassafras market was collapsing. Its initial investors included many men who'd been involved in sassafras ventures. They'd learned that American resources could be profitable. They'd learned that indigenous peoples would trade. They'd learned that ships could make the Atlantic crossing reliably enough to build a business model around it. They'd learned everything except the most important lesson: that quick profit resource extraction schemes in America tended to fail because they were based on unsustainable economic assumptions. So they tried it again, but bigger. Instead of seasonal voyages to harvest sassafras, they'd establish a permanent colony that could extract multiple resources year-round. Sassafras would be one export among many: timber, furs, minerals, whatever they could find. They'd build an economic engine in Virginia that would generate steady returns for investors. It was a more sophisticated plan than the sassafras rush, better organized, better capitalized, and it almost immediately failed. The Jamestown colony, established in May 1607, was a disaster by almost every measure. Settlers died of disease and starvation. Conflicts with indigenous peoples escalated into violence. The expected resources failed to materialize in profitable quantities. Sassafras was among the goods they shipped back to England, but by 1607, nobody wanted it anymore. The market had moved on. Investors watched their capital disappear into the Virginia wilderness with almost nothing to show for it. The colony survived only through a combination of luck, indigenous assistance, and stubborn refusal to admit defeat. But here's the connection that matters. Without the sassafras bubble, Jamestown probably wouldn't have gotten funded. The investors had to believe that American resources could generate quick profits, and the sassafras boom was their evidence for that belief. Yes, it turned out to be false evidence. Yes, The bubble had already burst, but the memory of those brief years when Sassafras seemed like a gold mine was enough to convince investors to take one more chance. The catastrophic failure of Jamestown and its eventual transformation into a tobacco-based economy that would introduce plantation slavery to English America all trace back in part to that 1602 expedition where Bartholomew Gosnold dug up sassafras roots on a Massachusetts beach. We need to talk about what the Sassafras bubble reveals about European understanding of indigenous knowledge, because this is where things get philosophically complicated. The English recognized that indigenous peoples had sophisticated medical knowledge. They saw sassafras being used as medicine and correctly identified that it had fundamental medicinal properties. The mistake wasn't in recognizing indigenous expertise. The mistake was in wrenching that knowledge out of context and applying it to completely different purposes. Indigenous use of sassafras was targeted, specific, and embedded in a broader system of medical and spiritual practices. It was a spring tonic, a fever reducer, and a treatment for specific ailments within a particular framework. European colonizers took this contextual knowledge and universalized it. If it treats some illnesses, surely it treats all illnesses. If it works in indigenous bodies, surely it works in European bodies. If indigenous peoples value it, surely Europeans should too. This decontextualization and universalization of indigenous knowledge is a form of intellectual violence that characterized much of the colonial project. And yet, paradoxically, sassafras does have genuine medicinal properties. Modern pharmacology has identified compounds in sassafras that have anti-inflammatory and analgesic effects. It's not a miracle cure, but it's not useless either. The indigenous peoples who used it for centuries were not wrong. They were working from empirical observation and accumulated experience. The Europeans weren't evil to think it had medical value. The wrongness came in the exaggeration, the speculation, the assumption that because something was valuable in one context, it would be equally helpful in another. The wrongness came from the economic incentives that transformed medicine into a commodity. By 1610, sassafras had disappeared mainly from English consciousness as a significant economic factor. It continued to be used in small quantities as a flavoring agent and mild medicinal, but the dream of sassafras fortunes was gone. The ships stopped coming specifically for sassafras. The investors moved on. The bubble had fully deflated. But the infrastructure remains, the maritime knowledge of how to reach the North American coast. The trade relationships, however fraught, are with indigenous communities. The networks of merchants and investors are interested in American ventures. The political authorization for companies to establish colonies. All of this survived the sassafras bubble and became the foundation for more sustained colonization efforts. This is how economic bubbles work in history. They're not isolated events. They're inflection points that redirect capital, attention, and human energy in new directions. The bubble itself may be irrational, but its consequences are real and lasting. The sassafras rush didn't make rational economic sense. Still, it altered the trajectory of English colonization in North America, which in turn changed the course of American history and, consequently, the trajectory of world history. A failed speculation in tree roots helped set in motion events that would eventually lead to the founding of the United States. There's something almost embarrassing about this for people who like their historical narratives to be driven by grand ideas and noble purposes. We want to believe that America was founded on principles of liberty and self-governance, and sure, those ideas mattered eventually. But before the Mayflower and the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the high-minded Puritan mission, Bartholomew Gosnold was digging up sassafras roots because investors in London thought they could make a quick fortune selling them as syphilis cures. That's the less noble truth underlying the mythology. The indigenous peoples who watched this spectacle participated in it through trade and were affected by it in ways they couldn't have fully predicted left fewer written records than the English. However, their perspective is crucial to understanding what actually happened. From their viewpoint, the Sassafras rush must have seemed like temporary madness, Europeans arriving and departing with their holds full of roots, disrupting trade patterns and ecosystems for a few years before moving on. What they couldn't have known was that this was just the beginning, that the ships would keep coming, that the temporary disruption would become permanent colonization, that the trade relationships would transform into military occupation. Some indigenous leaders did understand, or came to understand, what was happening. They recognized that English interest in American resources, even something as seemingly harmless as sassafras roots, was a threat to indigenous sovereignty and survival. But by the time this understanding became widespread, the economic and political mechanisms of colonization were already in motion, funded in part by the capital that had flowed through the sassafras market. The story of the sassafras bubble is ultimately a story about belief and its consequences. People believed sassafras would cure syphilis despite a lack of evidence. They thought they could make fortunes trading it, despite basic economic logic suggesting oversupply would collapse prices. They believed that quick profit resource extraction in America was sustainable, despite there being no evidence for it. And these beliefs, however irrational, however disconnected from reality, had real effects. They moved the capital. They motivated expeditions. They established trade routes. They created political pressure for colonization. Belief doesn't have to be justified to be powerful. That's perhaps the most important lesson of the sassafras bubble. The early investors weren't idiots. They were rational actors working with incomplete information and strong incentives to believe what they wanted to believe. They observed a pattern. Indigenous peoples used sassafras medicinally and concluded that sassafras could cure European diseases. The evidence didn't warrant this conclusion, but it was enormously profitable to believe. And for a brief moment, the profitability of belief sustained the bubble, even as the evidence mounted that the religion was false. This dynamic, where financial incentives sustain irrational beliefs long past the point where evidence should have corrected them, is not unique to 1602. It appears throughout economic history, from the Dutch tulip mania to the South Sea bubble to the 2008 mortgage crisis. The specific commodity changes, the technology changes, the scale changes, but the underlying psychological and economic mechanisms remain remarkably consistent. Humans are very good at believing things that serve their financial interests, and very resistant to evidence that threatens those beliefs. The sassafras bubble was small by the standards of later financial manias. It involved relatively few investors, small sums of capital, and a limited geographic scope. But it was America's first, the prototype for all the speculative frenzies that would follow. And it established a pattern that would repeat throughout American economic history. The belief that this vast continent held unlimited resources, that those resources could generate unlimited wealth, that anyone could get rich if they just found the right opportunity. That pattern, born in the sassafras trade of 1602, never really went away. It just kept finding new objects to attach to: tobacco, cotton, gold, oil, railroads, tech stocks, and cryptocurrencies. The content changes. The structure remains. When we talk about American exceptionalism, we usually mean political exceptionalism, the idea that America represents a new kind of democracy, a new kind of freedom. But there's also an economic exceptionalism in American history, a persistent belief that standard economic rules don't apply here, that growth can be infinite, that resources can be extracted without consequence, that fundamentals actually justify speculative bubbles. That economic exceptionalism starts, at least in English America, with Sassafras. The year 1602 didn't feel like a turning point at the time. It was just another year, another expedition, another trade good. But history is made of these unrecognized moments, these seemingly minor decisions that cascade into significant consequences. Bartholomew Gosnold didn't think he was changing history when he loaded his ship with sassafras root. He thought he was making money. The investors who funded him didn't know they were laying the groundwork for English colonization of North America. They thought they were curing syphilis and getting rich. But intentions don't determine outcomes, and the outcome of the Sassafras bubble was a redirection of English attention and capital toward North America that would eventually result in the displacement of indigenous peoples, the establishment of plantation slavery, and the founding of what would become the United States. That's a lot of weight for a tree root to carry, but that's how history works. Small causes, massive effects, irrational beliefs, real consequences. Economic bubbles that burst but leave behind the infrastructure for the next disaster. The Sassafras bubble ended in 1607, but its legacy continued for centuries. Every time American investors convinced themselves that this time was different, that this resource was truly limitless, that this speculation was actually justified, they were repeating the pattern established in 1602. And every time indigenous peoples, enslaved peoples, working peoples bore the costs of those speculative failures, it was a continuation of the violence that began when Europeans decided a medicinal root was worth more than the people who'd been using it for generations. This is the story we don't usually tell about American origins because it's messy, embarrassing, and undermines the mythology. But it's true, and truth matters more than comfort. Before Plymouth Rock, before Jamestown tobacco, before any of the narratives we teach schoolchildren about American beginnings, there was a speculative bubble in sassafras root. Investors were chasing impossible profits. There were indigenous peoples whose knowledge was stolen and whose lands would soon follow. Ships were crossing the Atlantic for the worst reasons, carrying the seeds of colonization in their holds alongside the worthless roots. And that's how America's economic story really begins. Not with a noble purpose, but with a bubble. Not with wisdom, but with greed. Not with careful planning, but with speculation on a tree that promised everything and delivered nothing except the infrastructure for invasion. The Sassafras Rush of 1602, America's first economic bubble, and the template for all the disasters that would follow. If you found this story as surprising and disturbing as I did while researching, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next episode. Hit that like button if you appreciate history that complicates the simple narratives we usually tell about American origins. And drop a comment letting me know what other early American economic disasters you'd like me to cover, because trust me, there are plenty more where this came from. Thanks for watching.